All right, so I've kind of talked about what's the general family cycle that most people go through, that we expect as a society, but of course there are lots of deviations from that typical life cycle, and as I said, there's growing acceptance of those deviations, and it's becoming more common. So I'm going to talk just a little bit about some of the deviations from that traditional pattern. The first would be singlehood, so basically staying single for a much longer period than the prescribed path that I just laid out. There are more single adults now than there have been in previous generations. People, like I've already said multiple times, are marrying later or not at all, and also more likely to get divorced than they were about a century ago. So about 8 to 10% of people remain single for basically their entire lifetime. Women are more likely to stay single for a number of reasons. One of the reasons is that after a divorce, women are less likely to get married, to get remarried, partially because women have been shown to kind of adjust to that single life after being married better than men do. Also, because of our age preferences, men tend to have kind of a wider range or pool of people that they can date or be in a relationship compared to women. So a woman, especially a woman who gets divorced, typically is going to want a man who's older than her. The number of men who are older than a woman once she's at an age where she's got divorced is going to be pretty low, whereas men on the other hand tend to prefer women that are younger and have a wider range of ages that they're willing or accepting to date. So they just have kind of a larger pool to pick from when you look at it that way. Highly educated women and less well-educated men are more likely to be single after age 30. African Americans tend to stay single longer than other ethnicities. It can be very stressful for single people in like early to mid 30s. Mostly because they're dealing with a lot of the pressures from that, the social clock that we talked about. A lot of their friends may be getting married, and they may see that and feel left out, or feel pressured to do the same thing. And for women, there's also the biological clock pressure. So we talked last time about the fact that around age 35 is where you have this pretty sharp decline in fertility for women. And so if you're getting into your early to mid 30s and you're not yet married or in a relationship, especially if you want to have kids, then you may start to feel that pressure that time is running up, and so it can be very stressful for someone who is single during this time period, particularly if they're single not of their own choice, like if they want to be in a relationship but it's just not working for whatever reason. In addition to singlehood, there's much higher rates, as I've said, of cohabitation than there used to be like a century ago. So there's an increase in unmarried sexually intimate couples living together. So U.S. attitudes toward cohabitation have gotten better over the past few decades, but it's still less positive than it is in Western Europe, for example. There's kind of a lot of like negative connotations to being cohabitated in the U.S. that don't exist as much in Western Europe. In the U.S., cohabitating before you get engaged has been shown to be correlated with higher rates of divorce. However, there's some studies that show that that's probably not a causal relationship, so it's not like cohabitating causes you to have a worse relationship or you can get divorced or something like that. Rather, it's probably the type of people who cohabitate are often going to be non-religious, and if you're non-religious, you may be more accepting to get a divorce if you're struggling whenever you have relationship difficulties, whereas someone who's religious maybe might feel like getting divorced is a really bad thing to do. So that may be part of the reason that people who cohabitate are more likely to get divorced. In Western Europe, on the other hand, people who cohabitate are pretty much just as committed as married people. 60% of American cohabitating unions break up within 3 years, compared to only 6 to 16% in Western Europe. And so again, there's probably some cultural differences contributing to this, rather than like cohabitating itself. Same-sex cohabitors tend to report stronger commitments than heterosexual cohabitators. So there are differences there. All right, in addition to singlehood and cohabitation, another deviation from the sort of prescribed path that we talked about would be childlessness. So either voluntarily deciding that you don't want to have children, or involuntarily there may be issues to where you cannot have children. About 15% of women right now are women over the age, I forgot the age I want to say over the age of 25, I think is the cutoff. About 15% of women over the age of 25 are childless. Again, that can be involuntary or voluntary. They may want to have children but may not have a partner to have a child with. They may have fertility issues, or they may be dissatisfied with the relationship that they're currently in and therefore not wanting to have kids. But a lot of people are making a voluntary decision to not have children. Usually that's going to be higher educated women who have a prestigious job that they're very committed to. They don't want to sacrifice their career development for children. And most of them are very content with their lives and with that decision to not have children. In the past, there's been a lot of negative stereotypes associated with this decision. A lot of people portray it as if like a woman who chooses not to have children is being selfish or self-indulgent or something like that. But thankfully, those negative stereotypes are starting to decrease and weaken. People are becoming more and more accepting of women choosing not to have children. And then the other deviation would be divorce. So divorce rates, they kind of skyrocketed from like 1960s to 1980s, 90s-ish, but since then it's been declining or sort of leveling off a little bit. Part of that is due to the rising age at marriage. So since people are waiting to get married, and it's been shown that waiting to get married results in less divorces, then we have less divorces overall. Also, that increase in cohabitation, so if someone's not married, then obviously they can't get divorced. And so there may be some other way of measuring this that needs to be tweaked, because if you have someone who's cohabitating for 10 years, they're in a really committed relationship, and then they break up, yeah, that's not technically a divorce, so it's not getting counted here, but it's kind of the same thing. So even the way they count divorces now may need to change to accommodate that. In the US, approximately 44% of relationships result in divorce, and that's higher with each remarriage. So for second marriages, it's about 10% higher. You have about a 54% chance of getting divorced, and with each subsequent remarriage, the rate of divorce gets higher and higher. The most common times to have a divorce are within the first 7 years of getting married, and also that transition to midlife. That's usually the time that you have an adolescent who is going through adolescence and then eventually leaving the house. Because those are the most common times for divorce to happen, you often have young children and adolescents involved in the divorce proceedings. This graph is kind of mimicking what I just said here. This is showing marital satisfaction, so not divorce per se, but your satisfaction in marriage across the different life cycle. So people tend to be pretty happy whenever they first get married. Once they have their first kid, there's a decline. As their children sort of enter preschool and school age, there's a decline. It kind of increases through adolescence, but this is a time where people are pretty likely to get divorced during this transitionary period. And then once the last child leaves the house, then you have this increase in marital satisfaction and then less likely to result in divorce. All right, some of the factors related to divorce. Again, these may be kind of obvious, just like the factors that contribute to a good relationship. Ineffective problem solving and poor communication. So as I talked about, if you don't have those good constructive problem solving skills with your partner, then it's likely to result in divorce. Particularly if you have what's called this demand withdraw pattern, which is basically where one person in the relationship is unsatisfied and they demand that the other person make changes, and then the partner basically withdraws because they don't like those demands being placed on them, and then you just have this pattern where that's continually going on. That often can create sort of a divide or separation, and if that grows over time, then that can result in divorce. So people start to increasingly disengage because of that pattern, may start to lead separate lives, may place more emphasis on their work and their friends and kind of ignore their partner, and then that can often result in divorce. Some of the major predictors of divorce, again, probably some of these are not too surprising. Infidelity, one of the biggest ones. So if you're cheating on your partner, then that's obviously almost always going to result in divorce. Money issues, so particularly if you're fighting about money often, then that can often contribute to divorce. Alcohol and drug use, jealousy, and moodiness are all other things that predict the likelihood of divorce. In addition to that, there's background factors, things like age, if you have had a prior divorce, family history, etc. Parental divorce elevates risk in each generation. So if your parents got divorced, then you're more likely to get divorced yourself. Socioeconomic status and education. Those who have lower socioeconomic status and less education tend to be more likely to get divorced. And then also gender roles and expectations, kind of as we talked about. If you have, particularly if you have a traditional marriage and the partners don't agree that you should have a traditional marriage, then that can often result in fights and eventually divorce. The consequences of divorce can be, pretty extreme in some situations. Obviously, there's huge individual differences. It all just depends on how well you can adjust afterwards. But it often results in a major change in the way of life of the person and also their self-image. So, when you're in a relationship, a lot of your identity kind of revolves around your partner, and once you lose that partner, you have to make a lot of shifts to compensate for that. People who have been divorced often describe it as opportunity for both positive and negative changes. So it's a time to kind of reflect back on what went wrong in the relationship and to try to adjust and change based on those things. You may have negative outcomes like financial insecurities. You may lose, some of your social networks. If you had groups of friends that were all, based on being married. So a lot of married couples will be friends with other married couples. And if you get divorced, then you may be kind of cut off from that social network. Increased anxiety and depression, and also financial difficulties. Like I said, those are some of the negative outcomes, but positive outcomes would be things like increased independence, freedom. You may develop higher self-esteem, particularly if you were in a difficult or abusive relationship. A lot of people after divorce will look for a new marriage, but that tends to be more crucial for men. As I alluded to earlier, it's been shown that women tend to adjust better to being single after a divorce than men do, and so men often will look for a new partner to enhance their life satisfaction. Most people, on average, will remarry within about 4 years of divorce. For men, that's often sooner, though. The remarriage after divorce is more vulnerable to breakup. So like I said, the percentage of divorces increases with each remarriage. And that can be due to a number of factors. One is that people who are remarried often will differ more in their background compared to those first marriages. They tend to emphasize practical matters in the choice of their partner, so looking for someone who's practical for them rather than someone that they are attracted to and feel in love with. In addition to that, they may carry over some of the negative things that they had from their first marriage. So if they had patterns of poor communication, then that may be carried over to the second marriage. Also, because they have gone through a divorce and have sort of come out the other side of that still, alive and functioning, then someone who is in a second marriage, if they're suffering from issues, if they're having problems, then they may be more likely to view divorce as an acceptable solution to that because they've already gone through it once and come out okay. In addition to that, you can have all kinds of stress from the family dynamics. If the person you marry the second time has kids, or if you're bringing kids into the second marriage, then you have all of those sort of stressors that are placed on the relationship as well. If a remarried couple stays together, it's been shown it takes about 3 to 5 years to blend the family successfully. Getting education on that and counseling can help sort of speed up that process.